El profesor Nkosingiphile Mkhize posee 2 maestrías, una en Ciencias Políticas por la Universidad Masarykova de República Checa y otra en Administración Pública por la Universidad de Johannesburgo. Es candidato a doctor en Administración Pública por la Universidad de Johannesburgo y su tesis está enfocada en la integridad ética, corrupción, las prácticas anticorrupción y la administración del riesgo en el sector público de Sudáfrica. Recientemente forma parte del equipo de investigadores de la Universidad de Free State. Actualmente, Mr. Mkhize es un becario Fulbright con PhD, visitante en la Escuela de Administración Pública de Rutgers University en New Jersey, Estados Unidos. Hoy nos muestra los resultados de su análisis de la intensificación de la corrupción política durante la crisis COVID-19 en Sudáfrica. Mr. Mkhize, you can begin your presentation.
Okay, welcome colleagues. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to share my study and research on corruption, political corruption, specifically white-collar crime and COVID-19 in the Republic of South Africa. You will notice that, corruption is a significant problem, especially for countries that wish to achieve sustainable development and growth. I believe that it quite fits within the topic of today's conference, or the conference that's taking place, which is on poverty. So you will note that corruption does play a role in how poverty is actually intensified within communities and societies at large. And I believe not only poverty in Latin America, but poverty all over the world, in Africa, Europe, although they speak of relative and absolute poverty there, but it does affect most parts of the world and their societies thereof. So in my talk today, I have a specific objective, which is to look at the effect of COVID-19 pandemic, this one problem or issue that we were not expecting, but we were forced to live with as a nation, not only as South Africa, but as a global nation, as global citizens. We were all expected to actually deal with, address this particular issue of COVID-19 on a very unprecedented manner. And it actually affected a lot of sectors, and actually affected a lot of industries and society at large. So I'll be basically looking at the effect of COVID-19 pandemic on white-collar crime and political corruption. To do so, I'll pay attention on the conceptualization of white-collar crime. What is white-collar crime? What can we see or categorize or actually group as white-collar crime? We then move on to contemporary definitions of white-collar crime and related concepts, because over time they've changed from when the sociologist who actually coined it in 1949. It's quite different to what today white-collar crimes are actually classified as. So we'll move on to examples of white-collar crime, which then can give us a chance to actually know what can we categorize as white-collar crime, what can we say this is white-collar crime, this is not white-collar crime, because it's always good to understand the concept maybe from practical examples that we have out there. And then whilst we doing that, another key element of this talk is basically on political corruption, and basically I focus on problematizing this concept. Why do I say problematizing it and not instead going for conceptualizing it, defining it in a straightforward way? It's because there's quite a number of definitions out there. There's quite a number of debates, academic literature that says that actually paints a picture that there's no universal consensus when it comes to what is corruption. And you will notice that corruption is actually, if one was to define corruption, it is very good to actually define it within context, define it within a specific culture, within a specific society, because what we in South Africa or in Africa would conceptualize or regard as corruption might not necessarily be the same as what maybe in Latin America will be regarded as corruption, or Eastern Europe will be regarded as corruption. But after that, I'll then move on to actually the context, the crust of the matter or crust of today's talk, which is political corruption and white-collar crime during the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa. So, colleagues, ladies and gents, let me welcome you on this presentation, and let's start on the juicy part of this talk. Well, let's start off with just analyzing and understanding the concept of white-collar crime. So white-collar crime was basically coined by a sociologist, an American sociologist called Edwin Sutherland in 1949, who actually argued that white-collar crime is or can be described as criminal activities that is done by the powerful and rich. So this therefore argues that, and especially coming from a sociologist, one can then say this means that the definition was basically based on a social class. It's not just a crime committed by anybody and everybody in a society, but it's a crime that's committed by certain individuals of a particular status, of a particular class. And these people are basically your rich and powerful. And you know that sociologists or theorists or even scholars like Karl Marx will then say it's the bourgeoisies who actually form part of this particular criminal activities. So it's not everybody who falls within, but this is, I must note, this is an earlier definition, because at a later stage, you'll notice that this definition was expanded from being narrow to something that's much more broader, from focusing on a specific class and focusing maybe on other elements that you can see. You'll see in the next slides, that's part of what I actually discuss or talk to. So as time went on, the white-collar crime as a notion was then associated with the notion of greed is good, because most people would then say, I want to reach a certain status or certain social class in a particular society. Then I need to be greedy in order to reach that particular status or that particular state in a society. So a big question is asked, especially for people who then say, but to whose extent, or to actually, when is greed good? Who is it good for? Is it good for the elite? Is it good for certain for certain groups? And if it is, then it might be a problem that we might all need to pay more attention on, instead of just saying we can live with this particular issue. But what is key from Sanders' coined term, which is white-collar crime, is that criminals are less likely to be investigated, arrested, or prosecuted than other offenders. So this particular social group, particular group within a society, are actually free from being investigated, arrested, or even prosecuted. You might note that that's what we currently faced with in contemporary societies, where people of a certain status, they go investigated for that matter. So nobody actually holds them accountable, from your most senior people in the judiciary to the presidents, to deputy president, to senior civil servants. They actually are quite investigated as a normal or other parts of the society would be. So the contemporary definitions actually gave more or expanded on what can be regarded as white-collar crime. They simply focused on actually having more of the middle income, and including, of course, the corporate titanians, which are the people who are rich and powerful. So one thing that we cannot dispute, even though there's been a change in the definitions, is that white-collar crime does hinder sustainable development and good governance. It affects the way in which a society is governed and how it moves closer to its prosperity and sustainable growth. So if we were to dream about having sustainable growth, dream about having good governance, we should deal with white-collar crimes, whether from a definition or straight from Edwin Sutherland's definition or from temporal definition, particularly. So what it considers me, okay, we view it as basically the nature from the nature of the crime. You will notice that later, at a later stage, there are certain concepts which come up or which were coined after white-collar crime. This includes upper crime, which simply says it's crimes by persons not considered the usual kind of offenders. But the big question here is who can be or who is considered to be a usual? Is there a person who is unusual in certain crimes, or is a person who is usual? So, but what I was more interested on was on the blue collar crime, which these crime now are actually mostly focusing on certain groups within a society. So blue collar crime is something that looks like an opposite of what Sunderland actually defined as white-collar crime. So blue-collar crime are basically crimes by members of less prestigious occupational groups. So it's people who are not rich, people who are not that powerful, like Sunderland actually mentioned earlier to say, white-collar crime is basically by the people who are rich and people who are powerful in a society. So let's look at examples of white-collar crimes. There's a number of white-collar crimes, and let's keep Sunderland's definition in our minds. You could say medical malpractices could be a valid example of white-collar crime according to Sunderland's definition, simply because medical malpractices is done by a certain person of status in a society, which is a medical doctor. They wouldn't be just a normal person or a usual suspect or a usual person within a particular society. Tax evasion are done by people who can at least have or afford or are at a certain bracket within a society. It wouldn't be a layman and person who is not, let's say, rich according to that definition. And then fraud as well can be part of it. Identity theft, those are others that can be considered as white-collar crimes. Insurance fraud and bribery. What is most important for me was bribery, because bribery also overlaps to what we call political corruption or corruption and its nature. So with that said, we move on to political corruption. And then, as mentioned earlier in the introduction, I said we are going to problematize it instead of just merely defining it. So political corruption is an elusive issue. It's a challenging issue that we've, as a nation, as a global nation, we've been trying to work on this. There's been international organizations which have been established to try and address this issue, but it has been one issue that is quite elusive to deal with. So before we can get to political corruption, what is what is corruption. So there's academic definitions of what corruption is, as well as practical or definitions by practitioners. So these include by the first one, which is an academic definition, it's by Nye, who says it's any behavior which deviates from formal duties of public role because of private regarding status gains, or it's a violation of rules against the exercise of a certain type of private gains, private regarding influence. That has to do more with how a person actually behaves within a certain context, and them actually looking to benefit at least for their personal reasons, or for private certain reasons that they have. So the World Bank, on the other hand, provides a much more straightforward and summarized definition of what corruption is. They say corruption is the abuse of public power for private benefit. So I think that's a much more straightforward definition of what corruption is. So we must keep in mind either of the two definitions. If we adopt either of the two definitions, political corruption will then be seen as the violation of formal standards that govern a position of political power with an intention to privately gain. So that's what political corruption entails. But at the end of the day, what you can also pick up from this definition, or key points from this definition, is that you're simply avoiding or simply manipulating formal standards because of your position, because of your political position, in order to privately gain. So that's the key thing about the definition of political corruption and corruption in itself. So there's different forms of corruption that exist out there, and part of this are actually grand and petty corruption. So these are the two main different forms of corruption that have been argued on previously, and that have been actually present in certain societies. So with grand corruption, it usually takes place within political formulation. It is part of the policy making processes. So it's the influence of those people who are involved in policy making. Especially, it has to be people, or it's done in a top-down approach, because it's where the most influential people, your politicians, your civil servants, maybe not civil servants, but politicians and other key stakeholders actually manipulate the entire policy making process in order to privately gain. So with that said, grand corruption is more about the level, not the amount. So it's more or less about the level in which it takes place than the amount that the person is actually corrupt for. A couple of examples of that would be like inside information, policy influence, political party financing, which in South Africa we've recently passed an act or law when it comes to political party funding. Although there has been some attempts to actually amend that whole law, it can be argued that the public felt, or people who actually participate in political issues, voters for that matter, felt that we simply do need a political party funding act, which will tell us which political party received certain amounts and who exactly funded a political party. And there must be a control of that, which I really think that it's quite an important move or act from a South African context. As you might know, in some parts of the world, that's not even present. So with petty corruption or bureaucratic corruption, this is just an exchange of small amounts of money or even favors, but through political or public office. This is exactly where civil servants tend to abuse their office in order to maybe give opportunities, give certain rewards to people they are affiliated with. So this is regarded as everyday corruption, where public officials meet on a daily basis with private citizens or certain people that they have interest with when it comes to corruption and doing what is needed. So in the context of South Africa, corruption or political corruption is a problem. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not something that recently started. It's not something that came with COVID. It has been there for the longest of time and through different types of political regimes as well, if one would argue. So it is a topical issue. It is a topic which is in the country's current affairs. It will be very much difficult to maybe go through a couple of news, be it print media or something that plays on the television, and not find maybe a sentiment or something shared about corruption in South Africa. In the context of South Africa, as I mentioned earlier, that it's important to define corruption within a specific context. In the context of South Africa, corruption is basically the private use of public resources for private gain. So this could be bribery, this could be improper favoritism when rendering a public service. And as time has evolved, so there's been certain concepts which emerged from the South African context when it comes to corruption. This includes the concept of tenderpreneur. So you ask yourself, what's a tenderpreneur? Basically, tenderpreneur, it's a colloquial word which in South Africa, a businessman who exploits political relationships to gain government contracts. So basically, it's people who are involved in tenders, but they're not legally involved in those tenders. So that's why they say it has to do with exploitation of moved on to the new notion or something that's relatively new to us as social science researchers and the public, although maybe the extent of it has been there even before democracy. The notion of state capture, which this notion is not new or not something that only affects countries in Europe. The likes of Hungary have been having such an issue where there's state capture. So this has also been part of today's debates and political statements on corruption in South Africa. So the effect of political corruption during COVID-19 then required me to look at the extent of corruption in South Africa even before COVID-19, because you cannot tell if there is an effect, if there is any difference, if you don't look at the prior issues and even during or even post, if it's possible. So I couldn't get to a level where I can say post COVID-19 because we're not really sure yet, although the laws which were made for COVID-19 have been lifted, but we're not sure if we are completely out of COVID-19 because it's still, I believe government is still observing the whole issue of the pandemic. So I've specifically focused on two elements, which is the types of corruption and the corruption hotspots. So then it paints, have we had new information or anything new that is tangible that we can stand on when it comes to comparing the two eras. So the types of corruption that are present in South Africa, it's the abuse of power, bribery, employment corruption, procurement corruption, mismanagement of funds, fraud is there, and then direction of duty as well, and then there's all sorts of other types of corruption that are there. But if you look at the graph, bribery is actually the highest one in this graph, with 17% of the participants of the Corruption Watch report for 2019 actually responded that bribery is a problem in South Africa more than any other problem, followed by procurement corruption. Now, that's really worrying, especially for pandemic or an era where everything is not running as normal, and everything was actually geared towards making sure that people are taken care of, and people do bind or do follow certain laws, or they have access to certain medication. So procurement then comes in during such times where government will need PPEs, government will need the vaccines and all of that. But this is not yet when COVID-19 was present in the context of South Africa. The corruption hotspots, on the other hand, it's actually the policing, which the police in South Africa are deemed or are seen to be more corrupt, with 12%. Secondly, it's schools where most corruption happens, which is slightly a bit worrying, because schools hold one of the key to a better society in general, which is educating the future and educating the youth to be better off and participate in economic activities. Then it's the mining, which also one might say it's because of the resource scarce that most African countries have. So you do expect corruption to be part of that industry. So if you move on to during COVID-19, which also slightly paints a much more similar, if not different picture than the political corruption before COVID-19. So maladministration during COVID-19 was the first one, where people participated in all sorts of unclear or even unethical practices to get certain resources or get certain benefits from the government. And then procurement corruption is the second, which is slightly similar to before COVID-19. And then the abuse of resources, embezzlement, abuse of power are also types of corruption which are seen in hotspots. On the other hand, was SAPS, which means the South African Police Services, which still means the police are at top, actually the ones who are more like the hotspot of corruption takes place in South Africa. So there's no much difference, followed by schools, which is the same as before COVID-19. So we then move on to corruption focus areas, where he did more reasons for corruption to happen. It's called COVID tiers. These were like the social reliefs that government actually, when people cannot provide, receive an X amount during COVID days, which I do believe that they're still continuing to provide that amount even till date. So 37% of it, of the corruption that was experienced, came from COVID tiers. One will then expect, because of the social relief program which government had, included also food parcels. Food parcels were at 20%, and police then follow after that. So COVID-19 did present a different picture when it comes to political corruption and white-collar crime in the context of South Africa. So is there any difference between the two? Maybe there might be, but a clear effect of COVID-19 on political corruption in South Africa is a complex one. It will take time, and I definitely believe that it will be something that could be done for future research purposes. We cannot say at this point, because much research is being currently conducted, and certain reports are coming up every now and again to actually trace the impact of COVID-19 on corruption and other issues that the country was already facing even before the pandemic. So there is a lack of available data to clearly indicate whether corruption did or did not intensify political corruption in South Africa. But out of that, we might want to pay more attention on food parcels and COVID tiers, which are the beneficiaries of the social relief programs, as key areas or focus areas for corruption-related, COVID-19 related corruption in South Africa. Okay, so that's
Thank
it.
You very much, Nkosingiphile Mkhize. I'm sorry, it's like
not a problem.
Very difficult for our language, actually. Very interesting, your presentation. Of course, corruption is one of the main subjects nowadays to study, to try to study, at least in our countries, like South Africa and South America. In Ecuador as well, we suffer from the same thing, like everything is corrupted. So it's a little bit frustrating to actually try to study it, right? And try to somehow moderate it or control it. And I think the pandemic as well was a time period in which Ecuadorians, especially from Guayaquil, our city, had a lot of trouble. Corruption was over the ceiling, over in the sky. Anything could happen. So in this sense, I was wondering, the variables that you described, the types of corruptions and the sites of corruptions, did you gather that information from official sources, or do you gather them using any special tools or interviews, or
Yes, I should have mentioned. Yes, I gathered them from a specific source. That's the Corruption Watch, which reports. It's like a watchdog in South Africa, which does, amongst the rest, its advocacy and research on corruption. So yes, I did get it from their website.
So this is the official source.
Yes.
So maybe corruption is much more wider than what they actually appears, because it's difficult to study. You cannot go and ask, "Hey, are you corrupt? Can I interview you?" It's very difficult. So from this perspective, and according to your experience and literature review, is the corruption in South Africa higher from other countries in Africa? Or have you found any difference cross-country differences?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting one, because I tend to always argue on this to say, are we saying corruption is more higher in South Africa or even other countries because we know that we can get certain information from those countries, or is it because there is a problem of corruption? Now, I'm simply saying that we might get a lot of sources on corruption about South Africa, but maybe we might not get a lot of sources about corruption in Burundi, or maybe in Niger, or even in Tanzania. That might be a problem to say, how do we categorize, how do we rank if one has so much information available and then the other doesn't? So it's that problem, because I think South Africa, there was a UN conference, if I'm not mistaken, around 2004 or 2, where they actually had implemented the entire criteria to check whether they're corrupt or not by the UN, whilst other countries were just had a summary. So after that day, most people got an impression that, oh, South Africa is corrupt. But the problem is that other countries submitted abstract, whilst South Africa submitted a full review. So maybe to say we are not corrupt or more corrupt than other countries might be a problem. But to just answer from the literature that I've went through, we're not the most corrupt. We've got countries or cases like Nigeria, where corruption is seen to be a very big problem. And one author actually argued that if you are, as long as you're not ranked above Nigeria in Africa, you're not corrupt. So they were trying to play around with the definition of corruption. They said, if you're not above Nigeria in the rankings, then you are not corrupt.
Okay.
So Nigeria, yeah. so that provides a picture to say maybe South Africa is not that corrupt. But my question is that are we
to morally corrupted or not?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a benchmark. It's like you don't go above
it's
this.
Like it's like in Ecuador we say like political corruption. I mean, at least this mayor construction.
Yeah.
So it's tolerated, it's tolerated, sadly. Yeah. In this sense, have you seen in the literature review what moderated variables can we find in the general theory of corruption? And if there is studies in other countries that they are more advanced in this particular subject, of what type of variables should we be looking for in the data in order to moderate corruption?
In order to control it, you mean?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah, there's quite a lot. There's quite a lot. But I'm more of a realistic person, a realist when it comes to combating corruption and dealing with corruption. I don't think, like you're saying, that in Ecuador there is a case where they might still, but they must get things done at the end of the day. So I normally saying, I call it living with corruption, because we've been having that notion, or that narrative was present when during COVID-19, where we said living with the pandemic. So how do we live with the pandemic? How do we acknowledge the pandemic is there, but actually do make certain progress and move forward? So in order to alleviate or moderate or control corruption, we simply need to actually address all issues, not even, if maybe I can put it, socio-economic issues. We need to address poverty, because maybe the reason is that poverty, all of these socio-economic issues are leading to our political leaders, are leading to our bureaucrats, our civil servants, to being corrupt. So if you make sure that you deal with corruption, if you deal with poverty, if you deal with inequality, if you deal with unemployment, then maybe, just maybe, corruption, forms of corruption such as bribery would go away. Forms of corruption such as embezzlement would go away. So make sure that you deal with socioeconomic issues that are out there, and try and alleviate all of those socioeconomic issues in order to get to the end result, which is anti-corruption.
For example, one of the variables that you mentioned was to be greed, and greed is one of the human characteristic most antiques of our humanity, But do you believe that in this sense, can we teach how to be greedy? tolerably greedy?
Well,
Can you teach that?
you coming to a new debate, which is I started off with it in my PhD thesis, to say there's maybe 3 reasons why a person can be corrupt. That is greed, that is entitlement, and the third one will be okay. I'll get back.
Culture, maybe, no?
Yeah, maybe you could put it as culture. So it's greed, it's entitlement, and I'll check the third one. So these 3 reasons are basically more of human intact. They're inhumans. It's what humans do on a daily basis. A person who's greedy, it's because of their feeling, like you say, it's something that's inhuman. And then a person who is entitled would be something that you feel when you're in a particular environment. And you ask yourself, how do we deal with entitlement? Entitlement, if a person is entitled, if maybe a person has been a professor at an Ecuadorian university for so many years and has contributed to so many things, they might feel entitled that, no, I deserve to, at least take some money out of the construction budget because they don't need it. Instead, you might want to have incentives, certain incentives in order to deal with that. To say, if you've spent X amount of years and done X amount of things, this is what you get. That's why some countries will have tax breaks because of people who behave in a particular, put a more of a carrot system in place instead of a stick. So say, we reward good behavior if you're not greedy, and you prove it to us that you're not greedy by not taking things that don't belong to you or looking to take more than
difficult
what you
to
need.
Control, though, right? So the last question is like very quick. How is the legal system in South Africa with respect to this type of penalties? Corruption penalties.
Are you looking at it from a formulation of policy and availability of laws? If it's about availability of laws, we have over 21 laws or acts that actually speak to anti-corruption or that you can use in a corruption case. When it comes to the enforcement of it, maybe there's a problem. There is actually a problem when it comes to, are these laws actually being enforced? Are they being implemented? Are we going out there and actually saying, you violated this section of this particular law, therefore you need to go to prison or you need to be punished? So the laws are there. There's no real gap in the laws, unless maybe someone picks it up and say, here's a gap. But there's no real gap that South Africa has when it comes to the laws. The only problem is the implementation of them. It's how do we enforce these laws? How do we enforce more than 20 laws that are out there?
Democratically, of course, without being totalitarist. Yeah. It's, like in Asian countries, they cut their heads of the corrupt.
True. But you then ask yourself, why do they do that? It's sometimes it might be that people now are desperate to deal with this issue. To a point that they're now saying, let's violate human rights.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mkhize. We are out of time, so Fabrizio is going to introduce the next exponent.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mkhize, for sharing with us your research.
Thank you.